Sometimes the world hides a second chance in the last place anyone would ever look. On the far edge of a forgotten rail yard outside a small Montana town, where weeds pushed stubbornly through cracked gravel and the wind carried the faint smell of rust and pine, a single train car sat abandoned on a stretch of silent track. Its steel sides were stained the color of old pennies, its windows clouded by years of dust and weather, and the faded number 147 barely clung to the metal near the door. Most people who passed it never looked twice. To them, it was nothing more than a relic left behind by a railroad that had long since moved on, another piece of scrap waiting for the slow work of time to finish what neglect had started. But on a cold autumn morning, as pale sunlight spread across the valley and frost shimmered along the rails like glass threads, a man named Lucas Walker stood in front of that rusted train car and saw something no one else did. Lucas was 40 years old, broad-shouldered and quiet, the kind of man whose posture still carried the discipline of years spent in uniform even though the uniform itself had been folded away long ago. His flannel jacket was faded at the elbows, his jeans worn pale at the knees, and the brown leather boots on his feet had walked more miles than most people could imagine. Beside him stood Atlas, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick coat of silver gray and cream, ears tall and alert, amber eyes watching the world with a steady patience that seemed almost human. The two of them had been traveling together for months now, moving from town to town in an old pickup truck that rattled like a toolbox every time it rolled over gravel. Life after the army had not gone the way Lucas once imagined. Jobs had come and gone, plans had quietly fallen apart, and somewhere along the way the idea of having a permanent address had started to feel less like a goal and more like a memory. Still, there was something about that rusted train car that morning that held his attention in a way he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the way the sunlight touched the steel, warming the metal just enough to make it glow faintly against the cold air. Maybe it was the silence of the rail yard itself, the kind of deep stillness that made a man feel as if the world had paused for a moment just to breathe. Or maybe it was Atlas, who had stopped walking and was staring directly at the train car with his head slightly tilted, as if he had just heard a sound too quiet for human ears. Lucas slipped his hands into the pockets of his jacket and studied the car again. Up close, it looked even older than it had from the road. Rust had eaten into the hinges of the sliding door, and streaks of rainwater had carved long dark trails down the sides. A faded auction tag hung loosely from the handle, flapping gently whenever the wind drifted through the empty yard. Lucas stepped closer and read the small print. The rail company had been clearing out and used equipment, selling off whatever was left behind when the lines closed. Scrap value, the sign said. $120. Lucas let out a quiet breath that fogged in the cold morning air. Behind him, Atlas padded forward across the gravel, his paws crunching softly as he circled the train car once, nose lifted toward the wind. Then the dog stopped beside the steel steps that led up to the door. His ears twitched. His tail lowered slightly. And for a moment he simply stood there, listening to something only he seemed able to hear. Lucas watched him carefully, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. After years together, he had learned to trust that look. Atlas didn't bark often. When he paid attention to something, it usually meant there was a reason. Lucas reached out and rested a hand against the side of the train car. The steel was cold beneath his palm, rough with patches of rust and time. He could almost imagine what it must have looked like decades earlier, rolling through the mountains filled with cargo and noise and purpose. Now it sat here forgotten, waiting for someone who saw more than scrap metal. Across the gravel lot, a few men from the auction crew were watching with amused expressions. One of them shook his head slowly, already guessing what Lucas was thinking. People in small towns learned quickly who belonged and who didn't. And to them, a homeless veteran and his dog standing in front of a rusted train car probably looked like the beginning of a bad decision. Lucas, however, only looked at the number painted on the metal door again. Then he glanced down at Atlas. The German shepherd met his gaze, calm and steady as ever. For a long moment neither of them moved. Finally Lucas gave a quiet chuckle under his breath. "Well, partner," he murmured softly, his voice drifting through the silent yard. "I've seen worse places to start over." Atlas' tail gave one slow, thoughtful wag as the wind moved across the empty rails, and somewhere deep inside the old train car, something made the faintest hollow echo, like a forgotten space waiting to be discovered. Lucas Walker had learned long ago that life rarely changed in a single moment. It changed in small decisions that seemed almost unimportant when they were made. Standing there in the quiet rail yard, with frost still clinging to the gravel, and Atlas watching the silent train car, as if it held a story no one else could hear, Lucas felt the familiar weight of choice settle quietly in his chest. The men across the yard continued their work, dragging chains across flatbed trailers and jotting numbers onto clipboards, but every now and then one of them glanced over with the kind of curious amusement reserved for strangers who appeared to be considering something foolish. Lucas had seen that look before. He had seen it in towns where people assumed a man living out of a pickup truck had run out of options. The truth was simpler than that. Sometimes a man kept moving because he had not yet found a place that felt like it might welcome him back. The wind shifted gently across the valley, carrying the scent of pine trees from the hills beyond the rail yard. Lucas stepped onto the metal stair beneath the train car door, the steel creaking softly under his weight. The door itself resisted at first, its rollers stiff from years of rust and weather. He placed both hands against the cold surface and pushed again, slowly, steadily, until the door groaned and slid open several inches. Dust drifted into the sunlight that spilled through the narrow opening, floating in the air like pale sparks. Atlas climbed the steps beside him, his nails tapping lightly against the metal. The dog paused at the threshold, ears upright, nose moving slowly as he studied the darkness inside. Lucas waited, giving him time. Atlas had once been trained to notice things people overlooked, faint vibrations beneath the ground, subtle changes in scent carried on the air. Even now, years after leaving the service, that quiet awareness never seemed to fade. After a few seconds, Atlas stepped forward into the train car, tail low but steady, moving carefully across the wooden floor. Lucas followed him inside. The space was larger than he expected, nearly 60 feet long, with weathered plank walls and steel beams arching across the ceiling. Shafts of sunlight slipped through thin cracks in the metal roof, casting narrow lines of light across the dusty interior. In the far corner, an old wooden crate had tipped sideways, its lid long gone. A length of chain hung loosely from a hook near the wall, swaying slightly whenever the wind touched the car. Lucas walked slowly down the center of the car, boots thudding softly against the floorboards. Despite the years of neglect, the structure itself felt solid beneath his feet. Atlas moved ahead of him, stopping every few steps to sniff along the walls or press his nose toward the floor. Finally, the dog paused near the middle of the car and looked back toward Lucas with that same thoughtful expression. Lucas crouched down and brushed his hand across the floorboards. The wood was rough and cold, but there was something different about the sound beneath it, a faint hollow echo when he tapped lightly with his knuckles. He tilted his head, listening for a moment, then exhaled quietly and stood again. The idea forming in his mind was simple, maybe even a little ridiculous, but it carried a small spark of possibility that had been missing from his life for a long time. Outside, the men from the auction crew called out another price for a pile of rusted rail wheels. Lucas stepped back toward the open door and looked out across the yard where his old pickup truck waited beside the fence. The truck had been his shelter for months now, the passenger seat folded down to make space for blankets and a small travel stove. It had kept him warm through cold nights and long roads, but it had never truly felt like home. Lucas glanced down at Atlas, who had settled onto the floor of the train car as if testing the space for himself. The German shepherd stretched his front paws forward and rested his chin between them, calm and unbothered by the dust drifting through the quiet air. Lucas smiled faintly at the sight. For a long moment, he simply stood there, listening to the wind whisper through the rails outside and the faint creak of old steel adjusting to the morning sun. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folded auction tag he had taken from the door earlier. $120. It was not a large sum, but it was nearly everything he had left after weeks of travel. Lucas studied the number once more before slipping the paper back into his pocket. Sometimes, he thought, the world did not offer a perfect plan. Sometimes it simply placed an unexpected door in front of you and waited to see if you were willing to open it. He looked down at Atlas again and gave a quiet nod, as if answering a question only the two of them understood. The decision was made quietly, the way most life-changing choices often are. Lucas Walker signed the small auction form with a borrowed pen while the wind moved lazily across the empty rail yard, carrying the distant hum of trucks along the highway half a mile away. The man running the auction barely looked up when Lucas handed the paper back. To him, it was just another scrap sale, another piece of forgotten equipment leaving the yard for whatever fate waited beyond the fence. But Lucas felt something different as he walked back across the gravel toward the rusted train car, with Atlas trotting at his side. It was not excitement exactly, and it was not fear. It was closer to the quiet feeling a man gets when he finally decides to stop running from the road and see where it leads instead. The sun had climbed higher by then, warming the steel rails until they gleamed faintly against the dry weeds growing between the ties. Lucas parked his pickup truck beside the car and leaned against the door for a moment, studying the old structure again with new eyes. Now it was not just an abandoned relic in a forgotten yard. Now it belonged to him. Atlas circled the train car slowly, nose low to the ground, as if mapping every inch of their new territory. The German shepherd paused near the wheels and lifted his head toward the hills beyond the valley where pine trees stretched across the slopes like a dark green ocean. The air smelled clean out here, far away from crowded streets and restless nights in parking lots. Lucas reached into the back of the truck and pulled out the few things he owned that mattered. A canvas duffel bag that had followed him through deployments and long highways, a small camping stove, 2 folded blankets, a metal thermos dented from years of use, and a weathered toolbox that still carried the faded emblem of an Army engineering unit. One by one he carried the items up the steel steps and into the train car, setting them along the wall where sunlight slipped through the cracks in the roof. The interior still smelled faintly of old wood and rust, but now it felt different simply because it was no longer empty. Atlas watched from the center of the car with calm curiosity, his ears flicking at the soft echoes each time Lucas set something down. The dog had always adapted quickly to new places. Years of training had taught him that home was wherever the person beside him decided to stay. Lucas wiped dust from a section of the wooden floor with his sleeve and sat down, stretching his legs out in front of him as he leaned back against the steel wall. Through the open door, he could see the long line of track disappearing toward the horizon, the rails catching the sunlight like 2 thin rivers of silver. It had been a long time since he allowed himself to imagine what stability might look like again. Not luxury, not success in the way the world usually measured it, just a place where the nights were quiet and the mornings felt honest. Atlas padded across the floor and settled beside him, the dog's shoulder pressing lightly against Lucas's leg. For a while neither of them moved. The wind slid through the open door carrying the faint sound of a distant freight train somewhere beyond the valley, its low whistle echoing softly across the hills. Lucas listened to it fade into silence. Then he noticed Atlas sit upright again. The German shepherd's ears tilted forward, his attention returning to the center of the train car where the floorboards lay beneath a layer of dust and old footprints. Atlas walked slowly across the planks and stopped at nearly the same spot he had studied earlier that morning. This time the dog lowered his head and tapped the floor once with his paw, not scratching, just touching the wood with deliberate curiosity. Lucas watched him carefully. "What do you hear, partner?" he asked quietly. Atlas tilted his head but did not move away. Lucas stood and walked over, kneeling down beside the dog. When he knocked lightly against the floor with his knuckles, the sound echoed again, hollow and soft, as though there was empty space somewhere beneath the surface. Lucas ran his fingers along the seams between the boards, brushing away dust until the edges of a faint metal outline appeared beneath the dirt. It looked almost like the corner of a hidden panel, something built into the structure long ago and forgotten by time. Lucas sat back slowly and glanced at Atlas. The German shepherd watched him with calm patience, tail resting against the floor, as if he had been waiting for Lucas to notice all along. Outside the train car, the wind moved through the rail yard once more, rattling a loose sign against the fence. Lucas studied the faint outline in the floor again, his curiosity beginning to grow. Sometimes the world placed small clues in quiet places, the kind that only revealed themselves to those willing to stay long enough to listen. And in that silent rail yard, inside a rusted train car that no one else wanted, Lucas Walker had the unmistakable feeling that this place might still be holding more than anyone expected. Lucas remained kneeling beside the faint metal outline in the floor, while the quiet rail yard breathed around them. The wind outside brushed softly along the sides of the train car, producing a low whisper that moved through the old steel like a distant memory. Atlas stood beside him, still and attentive, the way he did whenever something unusual caught his interest. Lucas brushed more dust away with the sleeve of his jacket, revealing the shape more clearly. The outline formed a rectangle about 3 feet wide and 4 feet long, edged by a thin strip of rusted metal that blended almost perfectly with the surrounding planks. Whoever had built it had not intended for it to be easily noticed. Lucas ran his fingers along the seam again, feeling the slight difference where wood met metal. It was subtle, but it was there. Atlas lowered his nose toward the edge and sniffed carefully, then tapped the panel once more with his paw, as if confirming that something beneath it was worth investigating. Lucas sat back on his heels and looked around the train car thoughtfully. The afternoon sun now filtered through the narrow cracks in the roof, sending long golden lines across the dusty floor. The space felt calm, almost patient, like a place that had been waiting a long time for someone to pay attention. Lucas walked to the open door and climbed down the metal steps toward his pickup truck. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he opened the toolbox resting in the truck bed. Inside were a few basic tools that had traveled with him for years: a hammer, a pry bar, a worn set of wrenches, and a small flashlight whose metal casing had been scratched smooth by time. He picked up the pry bar and turned it once in his hands before heading back toward the train car. Atlas was exactly where Lucas had left him, sitting beside the panel with quiet focus. The dog watched calmly as Lucas knelt again and slipped the edge of the pry bar into the narrow seam. The metal groaned softly when he applied pressure. At first nothing moved. Lucas adjusted his grip and pressed again, this time with steady patience rather than force. Slowly the panel shifted, lifting just enough to reveal a thin line of darkness beneath the floor. Dust drifted upward as the old seal finally gave way after what might have been decades of stillness. Lucas leaned closer and lifted the panel carefully. It hinged upward with a slow metallic creak, revealing a small compartment hidden beneath the wooden floorboards. The space below was not large, perhaps 2 feet deep, but it had clearly been built with purpose. A metal frame lined the interior, and inside rested a narrow storage box secured by 2 rusted clasps. Atlas leaned forward beside Lucas, ears upright, studying the discovery with the same calm curiosity he showed whenever something unexpected appeared along their travels. Lucas reached down and brushed away the remaining dust from the lid of the box. Faded lettering stretched across the surface, barely visible beneath the grime of time. He wiped it gently with the sleeve of his jacket until the words became clearer in the afternoon light. Railroad Agricultural Project. Lucas read the phrase quietly to himself, his brow lifting slightly in surprise. He opened the clasps and lifted the lid. Inside the box were several rolled documents tied together with a length of thin leather cord, along with a small metal notebook whose cover had darkened with age. The air carried the faint scent of old paper and machine oil as Lucas carefully lifted the bundle out of the compartment. Atlas remained beside him, watching patiently as Lucas untied the cord and unrolled the first document across the dusty floor. The paper was thick and yellowed, but the drawings were still clear. Detailed blueprints stretched across the page, showing diagrams of rail cars fitted with rows of soil beds, irrigation pipes, and glass panels built into the roof. Lucas studied the drawings in silence for several moments. It looked like a design for growing crops inside a moving train car, something far ahead of its time. The notes along the margins were written in careful handwriting dated nearly 80 years earlier. Lucas leaned back slowly, glancing around the old train car again as if seeing it differently now. Atlas gave a soft breath beside him and settled onto the floor, his tail resting calmly against the wood. Outside, the wind moved across the quiet rails once more. Lucas looked down at the blueprint again, the idea beginning to take shape in his mind like the first light of morning over distant hills. Sometimes the past left behind more than memories. Sometimes it left behind possibilities waiting for the right moment to be discovered. Lucas sat quietly on the wooden floor of the train car while the afternoon light slowly shifted across the blueprints spread in front of him. The papers were old but carefully preserved, their edges slightly curled, yet still strong enough to hold the inked lines that described a vision someone had once believed in deeply. Atlas lay beside him with his head resting on his front paws, amber eyes half closed, but still attentive in the way only a loyal dog can be. The silence inside the rail car felt different now. Earlier, it had been the stillness of abandonment. Now it carried a quiet sense of possibility. Lucas lifted the small metal notebook that had been tucked beside the documents and opened it gently. The pages inside were filled with neat handwriting, each entry dated from the early 1940s. The notes described experiments with growing vegetables inside rail cars that could travel between rural towns, delivering fresh produce across long distances where farms struggled against dry seasons and unpredictable weather. Lucas read slowly, absorbing each line as if the man who wrote it were speaking across time. The engineer had believed that one train car filled with soil beds, irrigation pipes, and sunlight could become a moving greenhouse, a way to grow food wherever rails could reach. The project had never been finished. According to the last pages in the notebook, the railroad had abandoned the idea when wartime production demanded every available resource. The engineer's final entry ended with a simple sentence written in careful script. Perhaps someday someone will finish what we started. Lucas lowered the notebook and stared quietly at the rows of diagrams again. Outside the open door, the late afternoon wind moved through the dry weeds along the track, bending them in gentle waves that shimmered beneath the golden light. Atlas shifted slightly and lifted his head, watching Lucas with the calm patience he had shown through every mile of their journey together. Lucas ran a hand across the blueprint showing long rows of soil trays fitted beneath glass roof panels. The design was simple in a way that made it almost elegant. Water storage tanks, ventilation slots cut along the sides of the rail car, movable racks designed to hold growing plants steady even while the train moved along rough track. Lucas had spent years working with machinery, bridges, and structural systems during his time in the Army Engineering Corps. As he studied the design, he realized something slowly and steadily. The plan was not impossible. In fact, with patience and the right materials, much of it could still be built using the frame of the train car itself. Lucas looked up and slowly scanned the interior around him. The old rail car was built from thick steel beams designed to survive decades of heavy freight travel. The wooden floorboards were worn but strong. The roof structure could easily support lightweight panels if the rusted sections were repaired. What once carried cargo across the country could carry something entirely different now. Atlas rose to his feet and stretched, his claws tapping softly against the wood before he walked to the open doorway. The dog stood there for a moment, gazing out toward the distant hills where evening light had begun to paint the sky with pale, orange streaks. Lucas followed his gaze. The quiet valley felt wide and open, the kind of place where new ideas had room to breathe. Lucas returned his attention to the blueprint once more. Slowly he began rolling the papers back together, tying them carefully with the leather cord before placing them beside the metal notebook. Then he stood and walked toward the center of the rail car, glancing again at the beams overhead and the empty space stretching nearly 60 feet from one end to the other. A faint smile appeared across his face, not loud or triumphant, just thoughtful. Atlas turned from the doorway and walked back toward him, tail moving in a slow, calm rhythm. Lucas reached down and scratched behind the dog's ear. "What do you think, partner?" he said softly, his voice echoing gently through the hollow steel walls. "Maybe this old place still has one more journey left in it." Atlas blinked once, then gave a quiet wag of his tail as the evening wind drifted through the rail yard, and the fading sunlight spilled across the floor where the blueprints had rested only moments before. The next morning arrived quietly over the rail yard, the kind of slow Montana sunrise that begins with pale silver light spreading across the sky long before the sun itself climbs above the hills. Lucas Walker woke to the soft chill of early air drifting through the open train car door. One of the blankets had slipped halfway off during the night, but the wooden floor beneath him felt solid and strangely comfortable compared to the cramped seat of his pickup truck where he had slept for so many months before. Atlas was already awake. The German shepherd sat near the doorway like a silent guard, his tall ears pointed toward the valley while he watched the quiet world outside come to life. Lucas pushed himself upright and stretched his shoulders, feeling the faint stiffness that always came after sleeping on hard surfaces. Still, there was something about this morning that felt different. The silence of the rail yard no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. A light breeze moved through the open doorway, carrying the scent of dry grass and pine trees from the hills beyond the tracks. Lucas stepped outside onto the steel ladder and looked across the valley. Thin lines of mist rested low in the distance, while the rails glimmered faintly in the growing light, stretching away like two long paths that had once connected towns across half the country. Atlas trotted down the steps and began pacing slowly along the gravel beside the train car, investigating the morning with the calm curiosity he always showed in new places. Lucas walked back to the truck and poured hot water from the camping stove into his dented metal thermos, mixing it with instant coffee. Steam curled upward into the cool air as he leaned against the truck and took the first slow sip. He had learned to appreciate simple mornings like this. They reminded him that life did not always need to be loud to feel meaningful. After a few minutes, Lucas climbed back into the train car, bringing the thermos and the rolled blueprints with him. Atlas followed close behind, his tail brushing softly against the steel walls as he moved through the narrow doorway. The early sunlight slipped through the thin cracks in the roof again, drawing golden lines across the floor where the plans now rested. Lucas spread the documents out once more and studied them carefully, this time with a different mindset. Last night the drawings had been a discovery. This morning they felt like instructions waiting to be followed. The engineer who created them had clearly thought through every detail. Water reservoirs could be installed along the side walls to collect rain from the roof. Narrow soil beds would run down the center of the car in raised frames so plants could grow while sunlight filtered through glass panels above. Ventilation slots would allow fresh air to circulate even during hot summer afternoons. Lucas ran his hand across the blueprint again, imagining the empty space around him slowly transforming into something alive. He stood and paced slowly from one end of the rail car to the other, measuring the distance in careful steps the way he had once measured bridge spans and construction sites during his engineering work years earlier. Nearly 60 feet from door to door, more than enough space for rows of growing beds if the interior was cleaned and reinforced. Atlas watched him with interest, tilting his head slightly each time Lucas stopped to study a beam or tap a section of wall with his knuckles. After a moment, the dog walked to the center of the train car and sat down exactly where the soil beds were drawn on the plans, as if instinctively claiming the spot. Lucas laughed quietly under his breath when he noticed. "Looks like you already picked the first row," he said softly. The German shepherd blinked slowly, calm as ever. Lucas stepped back and folded his arms while he looked around the car again. The rusted steel walls no longer looked like scrap metal to him. They looked like a frame waiting to hold something new. Of course, the project would not be easy. He would need tools, supplies, wood, glass panels, and irrigation pipes. But he also knew something important from years of building things in difficult places. Every structure began with the same first step, clearing the ground. Lucas rolled up his sleeves and reached for the old broom he had found leaning in the corner the day before. Atlas rose to his feet as Lucas began sweeping dust across the floorboards, sending small clouds drifting toward the open door where sunlight carried them away into the morning air. Outside, the valley slowly filled with brighter light as the sun climbed above the hills, and inside the quiet train car the first real work toward a new beginning had finally begun. The work began slowly, the way most meaningful things do. Lucas Walker spent the next several days inside the old rail car, moving with the quiet rhythm of someone who understood that patience was often the strongest tool a builder could carry. Each morning the sun climbed over the hills and poured light through the thin cracks in the steel roof, and each morning Lucas rose with Atlas beside him and continued clearing away the dust of decades. The wooden floorboards slowly revealed their true color beneath the layers of gray powder, and the steel walls echoed differently now that the clutter of broken crates and forgotten hardware had been removed. Atlas followed every step of the process with calm loyalty, sometimes watching from the open doorway where he could monitor the wide valley, sometimes wandering slowly through the car as if inspecting the progress himself. The air inside the rail car began to change as well. What once smelled like rust and abandonment now carried the faint scent of fresh pine boards Lucas had purchased from a small hardware store 15 miles down the highway. The store owner had raised his eyebrows slightly when Lucas explained what he was building. But the man had also given a quiet nod that suggested he respected the determination behind the idea. Lucas worked carefully according to the engineer's drawings. The first soil bed frame took nearly an entire afternoon to construct, measured precisely to fit the center of the car, without interfering with the steel supports beneath the floor. When he finally lifted the completed frame into place, Atlas walked over and studied it thoughtfully before sitting beside it, as if guarding the structure from invisible threats. Lucas smiled faintly when he noticed the dog's silent approval. Outside, the valley continued its steady rhythm. A distant freight train sometimes passed along the far tracks in the late afternoon, its long whistle rolling through the hills like a reminder that the rails still carried stories across the country. A few drivers on the nearby county road began slowing their trucks when they noticed the activity near the abandoned yard. At first they only saw a man working beside a rusted train car, but over time the shape of something new began forming inside the open doorway. The soil beds slowly multiplied, each one built from clean pine boards and reinforced with steel brackets Lucas salvaged from old storage racks. Atlas developed a routine of his own during the long workdays. In the mornings he explored the surrounding fields, trotting through tall grass while birds lifted into the air ahead of him. By midday he returned to the shade inside the rail car, where he watched Lucas cut wood, tighten bolts, and measure irrigation pipes with careful attention. Sometimes Lucas spoke to him quietly while he worked, not because the dog required instructions, but because the simple presence of a listener made the long hours feel less lonely. By the end of the second week, the transformation had become impossible to ignore. The once empty rail car now held 4 sturdy planting beds stretching down the center aisle, each one filled with dark soil Lucas had hauled in the back of his pickup truck from a nearby farm supply yard. Sunlight streamed through the repaired roof panels, warming the soil and filling the interior with a gentle earthy scent that reminded Lucas of the gardens his grandmother once kept behind her small farmhouse when he was a boy. Atlas seemed to enjoy the change as well. He often lay beside the growing beds, resting his chin on the wooden frame while he watched Lucas adjust the irrigation lines that ran along the walls. The sound of water trickling through the pipes for the first time brought a quiet moment of satisfaction Lucas had not felt in years. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the distant hills and painted the valley in warm orange light, Lucas stepped outside the train car and looked back through the open doorway. Inside, the rows of soil beds rested beneath the soft glow of evening sunlight, the young seedlings he had planted that morning already standing upright in the damp earth. Atlas sat at the top of the metal steps beside him, his ears catching the distant sound of wind moving through the tall grass beyond the tracks. For a long moment Lucas said nothing. He simply studied the space that had once been an abandoned shell of steel and dust. Now it held something alive, something growing. The quiet valley stretched endlessly beyond the rail yard, and the sky above slowly shifted toward the deep blue of approaching night. Lucas rested his hand gently on Atlas's shoulder and gave the dog a quiet nod, as if acknowledging that the journey they had started together was finally beginning to take shape. The days continued to pass with the steady rhythm of quiet work and patient growth, and before long the rail car began to attract attention from more than just passing drivers. It started with a rancher named Walter Briggs who owned land about 2 miles down the county road. One afternoon he slowed his dusty pickup beside the rail yard and watched Lucas Walker adjusting the irrigation pipes that ran along the inside wall of the train car. Walter stepped out of his truck with the slow curiosity of a man who had spent most of his life around fields and soil. Atlas noticed him first, lifting his head from the wooden step where he had been resting in the sunlight. The German shepherd stood calmly but alert, his tail steady as he observed the visitor approaching across the gravel. Lucas looked up from his work and wiped his hands on a cloth. Walter reached the doorway and paused there, studying the rows of green seedlings growing beneath the glass panels Lucas had installed across the roof. Sunlight poured down through the panels and warmed the young plants, filling the rail car with a fresh earthy scent that had slowly replaced the smell of rust that once dominated the space. Walter let out a quiet whistle beneath his breath. "Never thought I would see vegetables growing inside a freight car," he said slowly. Lucas smiled slightly and leaned against one of the wooden planting beds. "Neither did I," he answered. Walter stepped inside and walked along the center aisle, examining the irrigation lines and the carefully spaced rows of lettuce, spinach, and herbs that had begun to spread their leaves across the dark soil. His weathered hands brushed gently across one of the frames, as if testing the sturdiness of the structure. "You built this yourself?" he asked. Lucas nodded. "Mostly. The idea came from some old plans I found hidden under the floor." Walter looked around again, clearly impressed in the quiet way farmers often show respect for good work. After a moment, he turned toward the open door and glanced across the valley where the afternoon sun had begun to settle into the western hills. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "this valley gets more sunlight than most people realize. If you can keep the water moving through those pipes and protect the plants from early frost, you might grow more here than some folks manage in full-sized fields." Lucas listened carefully. Advice from someone who knew the land carried more weight than any blueprint. Walter continued walking slowly through the rail car before finally stopping beside Atlas, who had settled calmly near the doorway again. The rancher crouched slightly and scratched behind the dog's ear. Atlas accepted the gesture with quiet dignity, his tail giving one slow wag. "That is a good partner you have there," Walter said. Lucas nodded. "The best one I could ask for." Over the following weeks, the small greenhouse on rails continued to flourish. The plants grew stronger each day as the irrigation system carried water along. The beds and the sunlight warmed the interior through the glass roof panels. The once empty rail car now held rows of bright green leaves that seemed almost to glow in the afternoon light. Word began spreading quietly through the nearby town. A few curious locals stopped by to see the unusual project for themselves. Some came only to look, while others offered small bits of help such as spare tools, extra soil, or advice about the changing seasons in the valley. Lucas accepted the help with humble gratitude, always quick to credit the old engineer whose forgotten vision had made the project possible. Atlas remained a steady presence through it all. Each morning, he walked the length of the rail yard before settling near the doorway to watch the world move around them. And each evening, as the sky turned deep blue above the distant hills, Lucas often stood beside him at the entrance of the train car and looked back at the rows of living green plants that now filled the space. What had once been a rusted shell abandoned by time had slowly become something unexpected, a place of growth, a place of quiet purpose. And as the wind moved gently through the valley and the scent of fresh soil drifted through the open door, Lucas began to realize that sometimes the most remarkable journeys do not happen on the rails themselves, but in the still places where someone finally decides to stop and build something new. Autumn arrived quietly in the valley, carried on cooler winds that brushed through the tall grass along the abandoned rails and turned the distant hills a deeper shade of gold. Nearly 3 months had passed since Lucas Walker first opened the rusted door of the forgotten train car, and the change inside it was now impossible to overlook. What had once been an empty shell of steel and dust had become a living space filled with rows of vibrant green plants stretching from one end of the car to the other. The sunlight pouring through the glass roof panels warmed the soil each morning, and the irrigation system Lucas had carefully installed carried steady lines of water along the wooden beds where lettuce, herbs, and leafy greens now grew thick and healthy. Atlas moved quietly through the space with the calm confidence of a dog who knew this place belonged to them. Each day began with the same peaceful routine. Lucas stepped outside with his coffee while the early light touched the rails and the valley slowly woke around them. Atlas walked the edge of the rail yard, his paws moving through the tall grass while birds lifted into the pale sky ahead of him. By mid-morning, Lucas would already be inside the train car trimming leaves, adjusting the irrigation valves, or preparing the next set of soil trays for planting. The quiet project that had once seemed like an unusual experiment was now producing more fresh vegetables than Lucas had expected. At first, he carried small baskets into town, offering them to the same hardware store and grocery market that had sold him his early supplies. The store owner, who once looked puzzled by Lucas's plan, now greeted him with a broad smile each time he walked through the door carrying crates of crisp lettuce and fragrant herbs. People in town began asking where the vegetables came from. When they heard the answer, many drove out along the county road just to see the rail car for themselves. On most afternoons, a few trucks would park near the fence while curious visitors stepped carefully across the gravel and looked inside the unusual greenhouse on rails. Some stood quietly in surprise. Others laughed in disbelief. But nearly everyone left with a new respect for what Lucas had built with patience and determination. Walter Briggs continued stopping by from time to time as well, often leaning against the doorway while discussing soil mixtures or weather patterns that might affect the crops. He never spoke loudly about it, but his quiet approval carried weight with the farming families across the valley. As winter approached, Lucas reinforced the walls with additional insulation panels and installed small solar-powered heaters along the interior beams to protect the plants during cold nights. The old engineer's design had included notes about managing temperature inside the rail car, and Lucas followed those instructions carefully. Atlas often slept beside the warm soil beds during the colder evenings, the steady rhythm of his breathing echoing softly through the quiet space, while frost formed along the rails outside. One evening, as the first snow of the season drifted down across the valley, Lucas stood at the open doorway beside his loyal companion and looked across the transformed interior of the rail car. The rows of green plants stretched beneath the soft glow of hanging lamps powered by the solar panels he had installed along the roofline. Outside the rail yard lay silent beneath a blanket of white, but inside the train car life continued to grow in quiet defiance of the cold. Atlas sat beside him with his thick coat catching the warm light, his amber eyes reflecting the calm satisfaction of a place that had finally become home. Lucas rested his hand gently on the dog's shoulder and looked out toward the distant hills where the snow clouds drifted slowly across the sky. Months earlier he had stood in this same spot with little more than an idea and a rusted piece of forgotten machinery. Now the old rail car held rows of living green plants, a steady purpose, and a future that felt more certain than any road he had followed before. The wind moved softly through the valley as the snow continued falling, and Lucas allowed himself a quiet smile. Sometimes the world hides its greatest opportunities in places everyone else overlooks, waiting patiently for someone willing to see what might grow there.